Welcome, everybody. Tonight's talk is the science of tick-borne pathogens and testing, and we are going to have a conversation with Paul Killinger of TickReport. Paul has directed the education and outreach efforts for TickReport testing service in Amherst, Massachusetts since 2018. Well, much of their research and service is focused close to home in Western Massachusetts. The TickReport lab regularly tests ticks from more than 20 countries across 6 continents. The lab's approach to passive surveillance of ticks and tick bites provides valuable insight on the seasonal activity of ticks, as well as the geographic distribution of tick species and pathogens. Um, Welcome, Paul, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to join us.
Thank you, everyone. And can you hear me okay? You with?
Yes.
Cool. All right. I'm going to bring up a screen with a PowerPoint slide, and fair warning, the first slide will have a picture of a tick. Brace yourself. Okay. And Maria, give me a wave if you're seeing the right screen. Cool. All right. Now that we've got that out of the way. So yes, I am speaking on behalf of the TickReport testing lab. We are in Amherst, Massachusetts, have been for a very long time. This is our 18th year of testing. We grew up on the UMass campus, and in 2020, as a result of some things that were happening in 2020, it became clear that it wasn't going to be sustainable to stay there. So we moved about a block down the street, where we have some independence there, but are still basically trying to do everything the same way we have since 2006 when we started. So we do a lot of different types of research. Some is sort of the traditional, we put on boots and go out into the woods and grass to with flags to collect ticks sort of in their natural habitat, do that sort of testing. We do some mosquito surveillance, especially for towns, but also other sort of outdoor agencies. But really what keeps us busy around the year, every single week of the year, is when people anywhere on the globe find a tick attached to themselves or a family member or a pet. They can send it to our lab and we will do DNA and RNA testing to see what pathogens that tick is carrying. So not only Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, but an additional 23 or so pathogens. We have a full panel of 25 tests. And in a typical year, we'll do anywhere between 10 and 20,000 samples, both passive from individuals and other projects that we do for public agencies, for universities, for all sorts of groups there. So this is a map that just shows puts a pin in every unique zip code from which we have received a tick. And so it makes a pretty good point about our reach, I think. And some of this, it's not to say that this is where all of the ticks are. Certainly there's some that depends on just awareness of the service, but it also really relies on where the people are. You know, if we overlaid this with a population density map, I think that those maps would line up fairly well. It's kind of a combination of the two, but yeah, this is an example of our reach. And so what we're doing, in addition to simply we get a a tick from Bob, and we tell Bob how many, or if pathogens are in that tick, how many there are. But we also feed all of that data into sort of a larger model that that we hope supports larger public health awareness and education for those who aren't necessarily testing a tick for us. So we're asking questions of who is bitten. That probably for me the most useful there is just age distribution. We know that small children are frequently bitten. There's a number of factors that go into it, but most of the ticks that we test come from people under the age of 15 or so and over the age of 60 or so. When are they bitten? That's especially looking during the year, and I'll have a chart or two in a moment that will show us a little bit of the results there about the really consistent patterns of tick activity that we observe every year. Where are they bitten? Both map like this, so where in the world are ticks biting, but also where on the person are they biting? And we see some patterns there. Most ticks are going to start kind of from the knee down, and they're going to climb against gravity until they find a good place to bite. And so that sort of varies quite a bit. It can vary by species, and we see some patterns like the most engorged ticks, so ticks that have fed the longest. In general, there's a pretty good chance if a tick has fed for, say, 5 or 6 days or longer, there's a pretty good chance that it was found in the hair of a child under the age of 11, because kids move very quickly. It's hard to get them to sit still to check, and kids just have different behaviors from us. They may make it a little bit easier for a tick to get attached up there by kind of rolling around on the ground, or kids are not quite as long as most adults, and so ticks may have just a shorter trip to travel from below the knee up to the head. But that's some of the patterns that we see there. And then always asking what tick species are biting, and within each of those species, what pathogens are they carrying? So if we look at that seasonal distribution, here are two charts that are just showing a single year's activity. The chart on top, we have that's life stage of the tick. So ticks have either 3 or 4 life stages, as you depending on how you count it. Officially, they have 4. One of those being the stage of being an egg, which I don't always find very useful. Eggs are not very risky for us. So green bars there, which are also the tallest if colors aren't working very well. Green bars are adults. The yellow bar is the nymph stage, which is sort of the teenager of the tick world. And then little blue bars that may be difficult to see are the larval stage. So those are ticks that have just hatched and are looking for their first meal. And when we look at that chart left to right, this is a single year, and it's grouped by week. So every single cluster is 1 week of the year. When we look down at the second chart, blue this is genus, the genus of the ticks. So blue is Ixodes, and most famous species in the Ixodes genus is, of course, Ixodes scapularis, or the deer tick, public enemy number 1. We see that they're certainly dominant here. The yellow bars are dermacenter ticks, like the American dog tick, also very common. And then the green bars are amblyomma ticks, like the Lone Star tick. And so, again, looking at the top bar, we see that adult stage ticks, especially when we're looking at deer ticks, really have two peak seasons. And this is a point that I always like to make because there's this sort of general idea that ticks are a summer nuisance. And so we need to be looking for them in the summer. And that is true for dermacenter ticks and amblyomma ticks that are really getting off the ground right about now. But deer ticks that are the highest risk, they really aren't a summer critter at all. They are looking to be active as in their adult stage at the beginning and end of the season. They don't like the intense heat of the summer. Um, so the adult deer ticks are always going to be active in the spring. Um, Weather is going to vary a little bit, but basically once snow is melted and we generally have more temperatures above 40 degrees, and then in the fall they're going to be really active in October and November, and then that the end of that season is always really interesting to me. It's just like a light switch where from one week to the next, we will see that traffic drop by 80%. So deer ticks, adult deer ticks are out for the fall. They're looking for hosts and they're looking to mate. And then a switch gets thrown, kind of a combination of weather, duration of the day, and they just drop off the map. But that October, November, I always, any chance I get, I like to just remind folks that October and November, it's the fall. We're out in leaves. Who lives in leaves? That is, you're visiting ticks on their home turf. And it's just a time it isn't necessarily on our radar. So that is a really important time to stay alert for tick bites, especially since so many tick-borne illnesses really kind of act like seasonal flu or cold. And so I suspect that in October, November, December, even January, February, there's quite a few tick-borne illnesses that probably get misdiagnosed and untreated because they're assumed to be the flu. Quickly with the bottom chart there, we can see that the blue peaks, which again are the Ixodes ticks like the deer tick, that really matches up nicely with those two peaks. The other ticks from the other two genera, Dermacenter and Amblyomma, they really are more clustered in the middle of the year. So multiple stages we'll see more or less at the same time in the summer. So this is an example of one year. This was 2019. If we zoom out to look at several years at a time, we find that those patterns really hold up nicely every single year. So if you can see my cursor, I'm up in the sort of upper left. We're looking at the spring, summer of 2017, and then the fall of 2017. Spring, summer of 2018. Fall of 2018 was actually a pretty good fall because for whatever reason, ticks didn't seem to be very active. So lower risk. But we see that pattern going over and over. We had a bit of a break here. That is not that the ticks disappeared, it's that the lab wasn't testing because of changes with COVID and moving off campus. But we see that this is a really actually very clean pattern. And you can kind of set your expectations according to these established patterns here. So what we do qPCR testing of the ticks. We'll receive ticks. There's really no special handling. Our preference is always just a zip top plastic bag from the kitchen, and folks can send it to us in any way that they'd like. The majority of samples we receive just come in a regular letter-sized envelope with the stamp on it. The DNA that we target is surprisingly durable, and so we get those ticks, and we are going to crush the entire tick up, kind of turn it into a powder, and then go through a series of chemical processes that break down all of the cell walls and allow us to extract all of the DNA and RNA and concentrate that in a very small amount of very, very pure, very expensive water for qPCR testing. And we have a couple of different ways that we test, a couple of different levels of testing, but here are most of the pathogens that we focus on. And you can see at the top here, we have a split in the way that we arrange these tests for Ixodes ticks and non-Ixodes ticks. So this is deer ticks and their closest relatives, and then everybody else. And that is because there are pretty strong associations between the type of tick and the possible pathogens that they carry. Doesn't mean that we sort of base our whole existence on those assumptions. There are some that we take sort of a trust but verify approach, and we will test every single tick regardless of species. Lyme bacteria is one of those. No tick ever passes through this lab without being tested for Lyme bacteria. And anaplasma is another one of them. The others can be divided pretty well, but for those who want to go that route, we also offer a comprehensive package that will just apply every test we have to whatever the tick is. And from the user side, that can offer a lot of peace of mind. It also is really useful on the research side because these are well-established patterns, we feel confident in these associations between tick species and pathogen. But if something changes, it's going to be in that comprehensive package that we see that and that breakthrough is kind of discovered. And then all of the results in real time. So throughout the day, as tests are completed, they get uploaded to our stats page, which, in addition to showing these types of patterns, also show infection. So you can filter by date or state or zip code or various tick genus or species. You can filter by pathogen, and you can see how many we've tested, how many were positive, and that's just at tickreport.com/stats. That's something certainly at the end that can add any links in the comments if needed. But that is how how we approach testing, qPCR testing. We're homogenizing the entire tick, so it's a much more straightforward process in many ways compared to diagnostic testing, which is complicated, is not perfect. There's a lot of challenges both in just the fundamentals of diagnostic testing that looks at antibodies, and then it can be complicated even more when it's not used in the best way. But we're doing direct detection of the pathogen itself. We are grinding up the entire tick, so we don't have other potential complications of pathogens sort of hiding in certain organs or certain tissues and not being something we can withdraw. And it is kind of as close to 100% accurate as science can responsibly claim to be. Um, we have multiple overlapping internal control tests where we are also measuring the quality of the DNA and RNA in the tick itself. So we're not just taking a tube, running the test, and saying, "Oh, well, that must be clean." We're also making sure that the actual condition of the tick, uh, as measured by the same qPCR technology, is within the range that we've established we're comfortable with for accuracy. And that is something that has taken a lot of time and effort. I think it's something that is a little bit unique to our lab, and it's something that um, took a lot to get here, but it's something I'm very proud of. And really, when I'm discussing results with folks, really gives a lot of confidence in the test that we can point to. So, results of those tests. This is a whole lot. There are a whole lot of numbers on this screen, but really there is a main point that I'd like to take away. A lot of times folks are asking us what patterns we're seeing in the infection rates among ticks. So, are more ticks getting infected? Are we seeing an increase of pathogen X, Y, or Z? And if you look at the bottom table here, so every row is a different pathogen. Borrelia burgdorferi causes Lyme disease. Anaplasma phagocytophilum causes anaplasmosis. Babesia microti causes the most common form of babesiosis. Borrelia miyamotoi causes hard tick relapsing fever. And then Powassan virus is also on the radar here. And if you go across those rows from 2017 to 2023, the infection rates are actually, to me, reassuringly stable. So in the ticks themselves, the proportion of ticks that are carrying at least one pathogen is actually pretty stable from year to year. And those differences for the most part aren't really statistically significant if we dig into them. It's also, I liked when I was putting through this table, I liked how it sort of gave me a little surprise that I needed to dig into. And it's a place where it really shows some of the process that I go through when I'm looking at publications talking about tick infections, or just about any sort of scientific article, where if I just look at these infection rates, I see over here, not there, I can't highlight things, in the lower right, it looks like 2023 was actually a pretty good year. It looks like infection rates are dropping. This is great news for the world. I don't know how we did it, but we've got these ticks on the run. That might not be entirely true. If we dig into it, I'll touch on some of the points that really can affect infection rates in general. But in 2023, it turns out that we got a much higher proportion of nymph stage Ixodes ticks versus adults. Normally, partly this is just tick behavioral patterns, and partly it's probably just adults are easier to notice. But normally we have about 2-to-1 adults to nymphs, or 3-to-1 adults to nymphs. In 2023, that was closer to 1-to-1, just in terms of the ticks that people were finding and sending to us. And as a result of that, nymphs almost always have a lower infection rate than adults. In New England, on average, we find that somewhere between 28 to 30% of nymph stage deer ticks have at least one pathogen. At the adult stage, it's more like 50 to 52% overall. So when we are much heavier on the adults, then our overall infection rate, when we put everything together, tends to be 33-34%. In 2023, when that ratio of adults to nymphs changed, it kind of assigned more weight to those nymphal infection rates and appears to bring the overall average down. But if we broke out nymphs and adults, it's going to be about the same. There's also a little bit of a change in geography where the more of these Ixodes ticks that we get from farther away from the Northeast, in general, the lower their infection rates are going to be, and that can bring our average down a little bit as well, which means that it takes a little bit more explanation, but in most cases, those other areas are places where the surveillance historically hasn't been as strong. So it's adding more work for for interpreting results, but it's another kind of side effect of improved surveillance overall. Okay. So when we look at, in general, how infection rates are determined, first we're going to look at tick species. So Ixodes ticks, like the deer tick, the absolute worst, higher infection rates by more than 10 times in most areas compared to other ticks. Amblyoma, the Amblyoma genus includes Lone Star ticks, and so they are they usually, in most regions, especially in the Northeast, their infection rates aren't comparable to Ixodes, but they have a whole different set of possible pathogens that they bring in, and have infection rates usually between, in most areas, let's say 5 to 10%. And then dermacenter ticks, like the dog tick, have very low infection rates. In general, they're a pretty low risk tick bite. They're also kind of part of a classic trade-off in the tick world where, unfortunately, the less common certain pathogens are, the more severe they tend to be in the short term. So dermacenter ticks have a pretty low infection rate, but when they are infected, it can be something like Rickettsia rickettsii, which causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is very serious in the short term, or Francisella tularensis, which causes tularemia, also very, very severe in the short term. So yeah, it's a funny sort of odds game where you're much less likely to be exposed to something, but when you are, the consequences can be very, very serious in the short term. Tick stage, as I was saying with 2023, adults are almost always going to have the highest infection rates. And really, it's because, for the most part, ticks are emerge from the egg clean. They're uninfected. They aren't carrying any pathogens. And so it's when they are in their larval form or their nymph stage that they're feeding on infected animals, usually rodents, and that's when they first pick up that infection. And once they molt into the next stage, they can pass it on to other animals or to us. So larvae, unless it was a very strange case where a certain pathogen seems to have been transmitted in the egg, they're going to have extremely low infection rates. They're going to feed on an animal once and molt into a nymph. So a nymph has been potentially exposed to one animal. and then nymph is going to feed on another animal, molt into an adult. So really, it's that a nymph has only had one chance to pick up infections. Adults have had two different chances to pick up infections. The one of the most famous and most interesting exceptions to that rule is in parts of California where there is a lizard, the western fence lizard, and its blood is borreliocidal, which means its blood kills Lyme bacteria. And nymphs feed on those lizards quite a bit. So there are certain places in California where if you gather nymphs that have only fed on some rodent as a larva, they will have infection rates at a certain point. But if you collect adults, that many of which have fed on those western fence lizards, there's a weird inversion where the adults, unlike in just about any other place, have a lower infection rate than the nymphs. And that effect is pretty specific to Borrelia. So it's not necessarily wiping all pathogens clean, but it has an effect on the most common pathogen, which is Lyme bacteria. And then geography is going to be another big decider. The Northeast US, one of the highest infection rates anywhere. And by the Northeast US, let's say from the state of Maine over through at least Pennsylvania, and then down to Maryland, Delaware, somewhere like that. And then it's kind of a gradient going out. And I do like to emphasize that these are all relative differences. I think that especially in a lot of public health communication, there are some rounding errors, or we're not paying enough attention to the lower part of that. And so we get a lot of parts of the country where say, oh, we don't have Lyme here, or we don't have tick-borne illness here. Let slow down just a little bit. There are very few places where we could honestly say there's no risk of tick bites and infections from those tick bites. And those areas where we aren't nearly as much on our guard are going to be higher risk for illnesses going untreated. And honestly, if we're sort of, my position is always whether the infection rate is 50% or 20% or 5% or 1%, this isn't a competition. And 1% still means that 1 out of every 100 tick bites could conceivably translate to an illness. And that's still very much, that's not something that I think is something we should be ignoring. Especially since in many cases, those areas are also, Lyme might not be the largest risk. It may be that there's another pathogen like Ehrlichia bacteria that is a greater risk. So that's kind of some of the general tick ideas. I know that there were some questions. There are always kind of questions about repellents. I wanted to look at a couple of points about repellents and then sort of open up to questions here. So sort of conventional repellents are all pretty familiar to us. DEET, picaridin, IR 3535 sounds very, very science fiction-y, but these are all kind of very common over-the-counter synthetic repellents that have really, really good efficacy overall. It does seem, this is a concern that we see in a lot of calls for grants. There's concern that DEET might be losing some of its efficacy. It's more, I see more of that concern with mosquitoes, but it might be that sort of some immunity is building up. So alternatives are certainly important. And for a lot of folks who uh, want to focus on essential oils, uh, there are some good options out there. And I will say this is a pretty new area of research, and I've been very pleasantly surprised uh, in the last few years with some studies that have come out showing that some of these essential oils are amazingly effective, and for me, even more importantly, they're amazingly long lasting. So this is a story that I'm sure will continue to change over the next few years, but with the studies that I have seen that seem to kind of be well designed, best sample sizes. Um, well, the top winner seems to be cinnamon essential oil, followed by clove. Those are kind of two head and shoulders above the pack options out there in the studies that I've seen. And then I have this larger difference in efficacy because there's a bit of a jump to the bronze medal. Um, and so we have geraniol there, and then there's another little bit of a jump, and thyme, peppermint, lemongrass, spearmint, cedarwood, they're all together there. Um, so this is what do we do with that? If you see the bottom there with lemongrass, cedarwood, spearmint, those are some of the leaders that we find in suggested as good repellents. Um, it doesn't necessarily mean that I would throw them away right now, um, because they are probably a bit easier to find, and perhaps more affordable than the cinnamon or clove. But it's something that I would certainly be watching for. Oil of lemon eucalyptus is another option there. To me, what has jumped out there is that compared to some of our conventional repellents, it doesn't last very long. So that's the sort of thing that you might have to reapply maybe even every 3 hours or so, which means a lot of discipline from you. But also, one of my questions with essential oils all the time is if we have to put them on really frequently, um, how is that going to affect our sensitivity to them? Repeated exposure to any of these sort of strong scents, really concentrated chemicals like essential oils, there is certainly the chance of sensitivity. Whether that sensitivity is better or worse than DEET or picaridin or whatever the case might be, I would say your mileage is going to vary. I can't really make a good comparison there, or make responsible generalizations. But yeah, these seem to be the leaders right now. They the good I tend to myself gravitate more towards the old traditional DEET or picaridin, um, and that's just sort of me. I'm fortunate in that I haven't had any sensitivity to it. One of the advantages there is that it is more closely regulated. So if it shows it as an active ingredient on the label, there are, if they if that's not accurate, there are potential consequences. Essential oils aren't going to have quite as much regulation, so that's just a case of really needing to look for the brand, um, and know the reputation of that brand for quality. Um, if you have good quality, great. Um, so those are some approaches to repellents that I'm happy to talk about more if I am able to answer anything. But that is what I had sort of prepared. I'd like to hand over the floor and see what's most important to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. This is Nellie talking for those of you who've joined us by phone. So we've got a few questions. I'm going to just start with the questions about repellents since we're on that topic, and then I'll jump to the other ones. One person is asking, does pyrethrin work as a repellent?
Yes. So, um, can work in a few ways when we're talking about pyrethrin or pyrethroids. Um, Frequently, that's kind of a larger group, um, and yes, it can be used to repel, and some can also have a sort of insecticide effect. When when you are looking at those products, that's really important to follow label instructions because there are some of these in the pyrethroids that may sound very familiar or sound very similar to each other, but can have very different effects. Where some may be intended for use directly on the skin as part of a bug spray, others are a sort of never skin. It's only on shoes, on clothing. So with that's going to be generally pretty well regulated, and so you're going to have pretty strict labeling. Just make sure that you're paying attention to that labeling there. Um, good, I would say good efficacy for ticks. Mosquitoes, I'm not quite as sure off the top of my head. Ticks and mosquitoes are can be repelled by some of the same chemicals, but in different ways. Where in mosquitoes, sometimes the mechanism is sort of creating a little bit of an aura around us, where those compounds are sort of breaking down, and they create almost a little cloud around us can be irritating to mosquitoes as they come in and they decide not to stay. With ticks, one of the major mechanisms is basically it's a contact irritant, and it's sometimes called causing hot foot syndrome, where ticks just their feet get irritated, and so they maybe aren't making as much contact. They're kind of it's sort of like hot potato sort of thing. You're trying to minimize contact, and if they're minimizing contact, they lose their grip and they fall off or they get brushed off. Um, so yes, can be a repellent, can be a repellent against both ticks and mosquitoes in different ways. Look carefully at the labels and make sure that you're using that particular product the way that it's intended.
Another question that Paul Ravina had is, do you have information on the percentage of efficacy between DEET and picaridin?
Um, well,
Actually,
I
that's not what I was asking.
Oh,
I'm
okay. What?
asking what percent DEET you would recommend and what percent picaridin, you know, what
Oh,
kind.
okay. Thanks for that
gotcha.
clarification.
Um, that honestly, I don't have very strong preferences there. It's um, usually just kind of going with whatever the manufacturer has formulated. They do appear to be very different concentrations. So with DEET products, you'll usually see much higher concentrations than picaridin. Um, I think DEET, you're usually looking at 70 to 90 some percent DEET. Picaridin is likely to be, I think in most cases, going to be closer to 20%. And those two numbers I wouldn't compare to each other. That's just different chemicals requiring different concentrations. So if I'm looking at those chemicals, I would probably look more at the application and the way that the claims that are being made about, sort of other qualities that you're looking for, whether it's a length rating, they're branded in different ways, like 6 hour off or 12-hour off or all day. If that's important, or waterproof, those are probably qualities that are going to be more useful for us on the ground. One good place to learn a bit more about repellents in an accessible way is tickencounter.org. And maybe we could put that in the chat if I'm not going to attempt to walk and chew gum at the same time. But tickencounter.org, that's at the University of Rhode Island. We work closely with them. I was actually there for most of the day filming some educational videos. Just got back into town an hour ago, hour and a half ago, something like that. I'm a little wiped. But Tom Mather knows more about tick ecology than just about anybody out there. And he's done some good pages translating different types of repellent products, whether it's something for people on their skin, people on clothes and shoes, for pets, for a little bit with yard sprays. So that's a good place. And you can probably, Tom Mather would probably have stronger opinions on those that you may be able to glean from that information.
Right. Jumping to a different topic at this point. So Margaret had written, given how tiny the larvae are, how can we possibly expect to find them? And wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit more about finding ticks on yourself and safe removal techniques.
Larval ticks, I think we have to start out realizing and accepting that the deck is stacked against us badly. They are incredibly tiny. Sort of the trade-off there is that their infection rate is very close to zero. So they're relatively low risk. One thing that does happen with larvae is that sort of two common possibilities are that you have 0 on you or you have 20 or more on you. Because tick eggs will be in a tiny little pile, sort of the smaller than my fingertip, maybe the size of a dime or something. And as they hatch, they're going to spread out across a space of maybe 3 feet. So in a 3 foot, let's call it a 3 foot circle, there could be 1,000 to 3,000 tick larvae crawling around and waiting for, in most cases, an unlucky rodent, to run through their little patch of terror so that they can hitch a ride. 1 foot outside of that circle, there's probably 0 larvae. So it really becomes a game of luck where either we make the same misstep that they're waiting for a mouse to make, and we happen to step right where they are, and we may get several dozen attaching to us, or we'll pass just to the side and there will be no risk to us. Larvae, I'll say it's very unusual for them to arrive in the lab. Uh, well, very unusual to arrive in the lab, period. Partly because larvae just behaviorally don't encounter us quite as much as the other stages. They're aiming for a much smaller target, and we don't notice them as much when they do bite. Those that come in, usually I think you notice it because they've been feeding for a few days, and they just become an easier target to spot because they've grown. They are more likely to be on the lower extremities. So they're probably not quite as likely to be making the trip all the way up to your torso or above. And they really are just very small dots. So unless you have really kind of flawless skin that you're looking at, it's going to be tough to find them. Certainly some people sort of immediately after being outside like to suggest a lint roller to try to pick up ticks that might still be crawling and haven't bitten yet. And yeah, if ticks are exposed and crawling, that's probably a pretty good way to do it. There's certainly no harm to that, so I'm all for it. And other than that, just kind of be as vigilant as you can. Understand that you're probably not going to run into many larvae, and they are going to be very difficult to spot. Even at the nymph stage for deer ticks, it's more common for us to receive ticks that have fed for a few days than totally flat ticks.
And
Because again, they're just very small. So as they grow, they become easier.
So could you just quickly go over safe removal for like, especially kind of thinking about the nymph and the adult stage?
Yeah. So there are a lot of different ways to, if you ask the internet, there's many ways to remove a tick. There's many products to remove a tick, and I agree with precisely 1 to 1.5 of them. My top choice is always going to be a pair of fine-pointed tweezers. I mean sharp tweezers. An example is these right here. If I can do this little trick, these are very sharp. A number of people across New England have seen me at things like the Hadley Asparagus Festival or other outreach events when I'm talking about tick removal and I'm gesturing with my hands and I stab myself in the other hand with it. I want your tweezers to be something that will hurt you if you're irresponsible with them, because it's that narrowness that allows us to come in from the side to grab the tick very close to the skin and lift it straight up without crushing it. That is hard to see here because these are very fine and ticks are very small. So I do have a common visual aid that I use. First, we have a plush tick from giantmicrobes.com. I love this thing. It's surprisingly accurate representation of an adult female deer tick. And the way that ticks bite, the only thing that actually happens is down here at their front end, they have a straw with hooks on it. And that straw with hooks is the only thing that actually enters your skin. It's the only thing that a tick is capable of putting inside you. And so they will be attached. If we say this is my skin here, they'll be attached and just that little bit is in there. But it's very effective at holding them. And then if we have a zoomed in version of my tweezers available with some modifications from the kitchen cookware section of any big box store. The idea is with sharp pointed tweezers is you're going to come in from the side as much as you can, staying as close to the skin as possible, grip that tick very close to the skin, grabbing as little of and squeezing as little of the body as possible. And I'm just going to pull straight up away from the skin, kind of slow, gradual pressure. I see that it's moving away a little bit. There's still some hooks in there, and then just wait for it to release. Slow, it's going to pull on the skin. It's not going to be very comfortable. If, you know, it's an area where the skin is kind of soft, it's going to look disturbing because you're sort of stretching your skin. But that's the only way that I really recommend. There are some other tools that are the reason that we go with tweezers is you have the most control and it scales down. So adult ticks are easy to grip. There's a number of tools that can do that, but the nymph and larval stage, if you have a tool that works kind of like a claw hammer pulling on a nail, chances are that's not going to work with these younger stage ticks. They're just too small. And so it would be like trying to pull a fine wire brad with a claw hammer. There's nothing to grab onto. So tweezers, doesn't matter how big the tick is or how small it is, it should be enough to grab onto that tick. And obviously, you know, when we're trying to do that approach of squeezing as little as possible, it's much easier on an adult tick. On a larval tick, the ratios are just going to change. You're probably going to squeeze the larva a little bit more. Do your best, but the tweezers are the only thing that are really going to be able to grip that at that size.
Thank you. We have a question about the oh gosh, trying to pronounce this. The dermacentor ticks have been found with Borrelia and POW virus. Is there no testing for that?
Yes. So like I said, every single, so I think what we're talking about there is Borrelia bacteria, most famously Lyme bacteria, but there are a few other strains that we would test for as well. And then Powassan virus. So Powassan, yeah, let's start with Powassan. It's plausible. I think Powassan virus way back was first described in a dermacentor tick, and every once in a while there are published reports of Powassan showing up in a dermacentor tick. It's still rare enough that it can turn into an actual peer-reviewed publication, so it's not a very high risk. In our lab, viruses are a single package. So regardless of the kind of tick, if we're testing for viruses, we're going to test every single virus there. We have never found it in a dermacentor tick. Borrelia is, again, we have a trust but verify approach where every single tick, whether they're supposed to carry Lyme bacteria or not, we test every single one of them. In my overall numbers of dermacentor ticks, I don't recall right now. I'm guessing it's probably 25 to 30,000 dermacentor ticks. We have found the presence of Borrelia DNA in 11 of those. I know the positive count much better than I know the denominator. And in about 7 of those, we were able to really clearly trace it to veterinary offices that have a tick kill jar. So it's just a jar of alcohol. If they pull out a tick, doesn't matter what kind of tick it is, they dunk it in there for a few seconds, and then it's dead. and that no one should use that rubbing alcohol uh, to clean a cut. Let's say that. Um, so that we find with about 7 out of 11 of those, there's a clear, pretty plausible source of contamination where other ticks that were infected, deer ticks, over the literal years that jar has been there, it probably got transferred that way because it can get transferred on the surface. The others are a mystery. It's possible that there was some contamination along the way. If you have a pair of tweezers in your medicine cabinet, after every tick removal and before every tick removal, it's not a bad idea to give them a quick wipe with alcohol, or even once in a while with bleach, just to kill anything that is on there. There are outliers where it's possible that those ticks were feeding on rodents that dermacenter ticks don't normally feed on. It's possible that there's sort of a that something is different about that tick's microbiome, because ticks actually, the reason that we're generally so confident that dermacenter ticks like the American dog tick don't carry it is that ticks kind of have an immune system of sorts that's very very comparable to our gut microbiome. So the same reason that there's a huge market for probiotics as an important part of our immune system, ticks have that as well. And dermacenter ticks have a couple of sort of regular parts of their microbiome that compete with Borrelia. They want the same resources, and they're bigger and they're stronger. They don't cause infection for us, but if that dermacenter tick kind of goes out of its sort of normal behavior and it feeds on an animal that dermacenters aren't supposed to, there's a good chance that Borrelia is not going to last very long, because the existing gut microbiome in that dermacenter tick is going to beat up the newcomers, and it won't have a chance to take hold. But so again, that's 11, I think, actually 4 true mysteries out of tens of thousands. I feel pretty good about that generalization, and we'll continue to test every new dermacenter that comes in for Borrelia, because let's not make our assumptions too strong.
Mhm. That's
Powassan
fascinating.
is so rare to begin with that it's a little bit of a mystery. It's hard to say how much is really out there, but it's certainly much more common. The 2 variants in it in Ixodes ticks, Ixodes cookii for true sort of Powassan, and then the deer tick virus variant in Ixodes scapularis.
We have several questions about statistics specific to Massachusetts for infection rates. And maybe you can also just say like where we could find that information.
Mm-hmm. That's another thing. If we could put that in the chat, just tickreport.com/stats, short for statistics. And that's something where you can search. If you're spending time on that page, I do always recommend that you start out with a less is more sort of approach, because there are some things where you could choose an option and it'll just return 0 results. And unless you are living that particular brand of nerdiness all day, every day, like I am, it may be hard to troubleshoot. So start big and sort of move in smaller. But when we look at those stats earlier, that's pretty representative of Massachusetts. At the adult stage, Ixodes, scapularis ticks, deer ticks, are going to have about 50% of them are going to carry at least one pathogen, and may carry up to 4. The top 3 here and most parts of the US are going to be Lyme bacteria, Anaplasma bacteria, and Babesia microti, red blood cell parasites. Borrelia miyamotoi, the hard tick relapsing fever, is one that I always do want to keep on folks' radar. That's a farther forth, but deer ticks in Massachusetts can also once in a while carry Ehrlichia murus, another bacteria, or Powassan virus. But that's really a Lyme in about 50%, and then everything else, Anaplasma and Babesia, we're looking at somewhere between 6 to 10% each. Borrelia miyamotoi, I think, is at about 3% in Massachusetts. And the patterns that we often see is those other non-Lyme pathogens don't usually appear by themselves. You know, we have for a long time kind of resisted the word co-infection. We like to just say tick-borne illness, because co-infection really seems to push toward this add-on to Lyme. And that is usually how it happens. In most cases, when we find Anaplasma, we also found Lyme. But we do, I don't know, maybe 20% of those Anaplasma cases are going to be by themselves. So, yeah, I think for me, it's just this sort of danger where if we think of Lyme as kind of a gatekeeper, that the presence of Lyme determines whether or not we should consider any of these others, that to me is risky. And so we always try to be really clear about tick-borne infections, tick-borne disease, tick-borne illness, rather than Lyme and co-infections, because they can exist on their own. Yes, that they can. It's less common. With most of those, it's going to be Lyme plus 1 to 3 others.
Gotcha. We have a couple of questions about products for treating lawns and kind of surrounding the house. If you have any information about that, and if there are like natural versus chemical choices.
So some of the questions that come in, people are concerned with toxicity.
Yep. I would start out by saying there are two places that know a little bit more than me and have slightly different opinions on it. One of them is, again, tickencounter.org. As I said, they have sort of multiple categories, sort of what are you trying to protect? Yourself, your pet, your yard, whatever. They'll have some good resources there. Cape Cod Cooperative Extension, their website also has some good resources there. A longtime great friend of the lab who worked for Cape Cod for Barnstable County for a long time, Larry Dapsis, was part of putting that together. You'll see a lot of overlap between those two resources, but good places to go, and you don't have to remember what I say. For toxicity, I will say in general, when we're talking about whether we're talking about something for the yard, for pets, for us, the idea of a very selective surgical treatment that will target ticks or ticks and mosquitoes and nothing else is always something that I'm very curious about. That's a very tall order, and so finding something that would only target those and not affect any other arthropods, insects, arachnids, whatever. I'll if I see good evidence for it, I will. I'm happy to read it. It's not something that I've seen a lot of study. It's more of a product claim. So I think that that's something that I would at least just be prepared to accept. That if you're putting on something to try to prevent tick bites, there's probably going to be some side effects for pollinators or all of the other little creatures around us that do all sorts of jobs that we don't think about and we never thank them for. So accept that tick-borne illness is very serious, and if that's a fair exchange, I'm not going to argue with that. Though I would look at individual products, research them as best you can. I'm always kind of wondering about longevity, where asking something to remain effective for weeks at a time, exposed to UV light and rainfall. So you're both degrading it with UV light and potentially washing it away. That's a tall order. I think I would, as much as possible, I would try to target and time things for high risk events. Like if I don't know, if an Easter egg hunt or a 4th of July barbecue is a big tradition for you, if you can spray pretty close to those, you're probably going to get the most benefit. And but one other item to remember with yard sprays is that if we're looking at perimeter sprays, ticks don't just start long overland journeys. So, they aren't just wandering across the ground for miles and they're going to encounter a boundary irritant and say, "Oh, I'm not going to this property." When they're moving more than a few yards, honestly, they're probably hitching a ride on some other animal. And it may be that animal is a rodent and, they're on the belly of a mouse and there may be some contact there. If they're on the belly of a deer, that boundary spray is probably going to be less effective. So it's not something we do a little bit of work where we'll do some yard consulting. It's not usually at the top of my list, but if it's something that you're interested in, absolutely go into it. I think with all preventative measures, I always try to just emphasize there is no, whether we're talking about something on ourselves or the yard, there are no silver bullets. So as long as you're treating that yard spray as a 10% contribution to the other 15 things that you're doing, and yes, that makes more than 100% because we want as much cushion as we can when we're talking about tick bites. If you can do that, fine. My only problem is that if you get your yard sprayed every 2 weeks with some product and you stop thinking about ticks and you don't take any other precautions, then I'm worried. That's when a yard spray is unequivocally bad. If it's affecting your behavior in that way. Other than that, I always kind of welcome people's experience. And I would go to Tick Encounter and Cape Cod Cooperative Extension to see what they recommend.
Thank you.
We do have, Marcy is very anxious about testing for Duncani.
Mm-hmm.
And she feels that it's not in the basic testing that you do.
Yep.
And that she's been infected a number of times.
Mm-hmm. That is a big question that is that is floating around in the world. It's one of a few pathogens where, on the tick research side, we haven't been able to fully match up to what's showing up on the clinical side. So I know of one research publication several years ago now. I was going to say 2 or 3 years ago, but I know that it was before COVID. So it's that sort of telescoping of time over the last few years. One study that has suggested maybe it's carried by Dermacenter occidentalis ticks on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. Nobody else that I know of with credible work has nailed it down in a tick. We have tested now close to 80,000 ticks with 0 positives. So yeah, that is an open question. There could be questions of specificity on the clinical side. Antibodies are very tricky. Telling the difference between a response to one type of babesia is very tricky, but yeah, I don't think it's necessary to actually call that diagnosis into question. Right now, there isn't really any support for the exact source in ticks. It's something that we're continuing to look for. We just haven't. Nobody has found it yet.
Just going back through the questions, make sure we covered everything.
Yeah. Oh, there's a question about looking at what dogs are testing positive for with tick bites, and wondering if one can kind of assume that that those sorts of pathogens, if like, you know, a number of dogs in a given area are testing positive for things, that like humans could be expected to potentially have those same infections.
Mm-hmm.
If you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah. There might be kind of specifics in mind there, but dogs are great kind of sentinel species in a number of ways, and some diagnostic tools are more accessible for dogs, partly because it's in the veterinary world, it's kind of a pay for the service. You're not convincing an insurance company to do the test, and so it's a lot easier in many ways to apply broader tests, a broader range of tests to dogs. And I think there's a lot of infections there that if broader tests were applied more regularly to humans, they might align a bit more. When we're looking at some of those, there's always the question of, is it pathogenic to humans? That's, again, if there are specifics, you kind of have to go through them one by one. But there are some things ticks carry that infect us, but not really dogs. Some things ticks carry that seem to infect dogs, but not us usually. Cats seem unbothered by an awful lot of what ticks carry, which is just in their nature, not to be bothered by much. So really, it's not the tick it's coming from, the pathogen and the destination all really matter. Yeah, if there are any specific pathogens that folks are curious about, if I know about them, I'll say. But there's some, especially I think there are a few species of anaplasma bacteria that will affect dogs. There really isn't evidence that they affect humans. So there is some there that is good to just kind of keep an eye on. That not everything that infects dogs is typically going to infect people.
Maria, do you have any other questions?
I just looked back through our emailed questions, and some of them were relevant to our topic this evening. But I welcome any of our guests to contact the center, and we can direct you to the correct resources.
Actually, there was one item in the email list that I did want to address: accessibility of tick testing. Tick testing is reading the DNA and RNA in a tick requires a lot of time and a lot of expensive supplies and equipment. If you were going to test a single tick, for certainly for the range of pathogens that we need, that we do, you could set up a lab in your garage. If you shop around, you could probably set up a lab for about $65,000 to do a single test. If you're going to do 700 to 1,200 tests a week, it takes a bit more, but things kind of even out. And that's something that we have worked really hard to control. We try to keep our fees as close as humanly possible to the true cost of testing. We've kept those prices stable since 2017. That's becoming very difficult. I don't know how much longer that's going to stay true. And we'll limit that as much as we can. It's something that is it is very expensive, and the way that it is sometimes set up for the public is not very efficient. So sometimes there was a state several years ago that consulted with us, and they designed their lab based on our lab, which is great for consistency, and they were able to learn from a lot of our experience, and they got a state budget line, and I figure that in their first year of testing, I know what the budget line was, and I know how many ticks they tested the first year, and I figure that each of those ticks cost the taxpayers of that state just under $900, because there's this idea of reinventing the wheel in each area, and that's, I do understand it, but building up a lab is fairly expensive. You may be able to move some of the equipment and some of the general expertise. There's also just a big learning curve with figuring out how to receive buckets of mail, and with ticks that some are in just a neat plastic bag, some are wrapped in duct tape, in Kleenex, in a plastic bag, some are in a salsa jar that wasn't rinsed out very carefully. A lot are in like urine cups from a doctor, or film canisters, 35 mil film canisters. And then, of course, with my younger technicians, I have to explain to them what a 35 millimeter film canister is. Kind of doing that, receiving all of that, and getting them into a place carefully where it's in a uniform little tube like this and ready for testing, ready for the normal science, while being able to just swear on your favorite relative that you can match and you can control the custody of that specimen all throughout the process, and you know that it was who it belongs to, that's tricky. And figuring out how to communicate that to people as well. And one of our ways that another thing that we do is we have a chat line, and we have, in a typical year, we'll have around 17,000 email and chat conversations with folks across the globe. Some are follow-ups to their reports or asking kind of how to test. Some there's no requirement to make a purchase, so we can answer questions that way. Sometimes folks just have tick questions, and but one thing we can do there as a starting point is, if you're able to email a photo to our email address, we will, and by we, I usually mean will look at it, we'll identify it to genus, stage, and look at feeding status. Combining that with where you believe you encountered the tick, we can do an awful lot of risk assessment there. Where if you have an adult female Ixodes tick from the Boston area, and it looks like it's fed for 3 days, I can tell you, here's the chances. I can say if it's fed for 3 days, anything that tick might have in it, it's very likely it was transmitted to you. Here is sort of the relative likeliness of each of the pathogens there. And so there's a lot we can do just through a photo, and I'll offer whatever advice I can give. We've worked for several years with the state and with towns to subsidize testing. That has kind of, that goes up and down a little bit. It used to be that across the state, testing was $15 for the basic package. Every bit of that funding disappeared in April of 2020 because all public health funding went in another direction. And as is the way with a lot of public funding, once it disappears or once it shifts gears, it's very difficult for it to return to where it was. We try to explore other ways of sort of private sponsorship, like if a local business even wanted to sponsor things, where it would just be, they would pay a portion of testing, and it shows an acknowledgement, hey, this is cheaper because of Leah Toyota. Looking at you. Nothing particularly for or against Leah Toyota, but they seem to be doing pretty well. So we explore options like that in what free time I have, which isn't a whole lot. It's something that we haven't really been able to convince a lot of folks on. So we do still have relationships with a number of towns across Massachusetts that sponsor testing. But really, when tick testing has been discounted, it wasn't that we were doing a clearance sale, and that's the actual cost of testing. It's that the testing was subsidized in a lump sum in advance by another agency.
And there are groups and organizations that do funding for testing. And again, please reach out to us. We can try to connect you if you're having trouble, you want to get your tick tested. Maybe we can connect you with an organization that does have the funds to help out.
And if you know any businesses that want to sponsor it for an area, send them our way. You know, the way we do a lot of it, we set up these discounts in a region. So if you put in a certain town and zip code combination, it would just like, hey, thanks to, again, Leah Toyota, just because it's a local thing that first came to mind. Yeah, that is an option. So we'll, on our side, we're fighting to keep prices where they are. Honestly, some of the higher levels of testing subsidize the $50 level. It's a little bit easier now than in 2021, but you know, if you've noticed some price changes in the grocery store, in 2021 it was 20 times worse in lab supplies. I know that between early 2020 and early 2021, just the price of a pair of nitrile gloves, lab gloves that we wear, that price increased by 26 times. Used to be pretty cheap, but you know, at the time that everybody was competing to find PPP, yep, it's no longer 26 times what it was in 2019, but it's not the price it was in 2019. So that unfortunately is just another player in the room that we're contending with. But really, you know, what we can do, any help that we can give that just spends my time and knowledge, we give as much of that as we can, and we continue to look for solutions on the lab testing as we can.
And Paul, as always, we're very, very grateful that you offered your time, particularly today when you've come all the way from Rhode Island.
Yep.
And the knowledge that you can share with our clients and viewers is very valuable.
And the feeling is always mutual when we have folks in especially around the Pioneer Valley, who get a positive result and don't know what to do next. You know, we try to be very careful about sort of the medical advice side, and one of the ways that we can get past that is just to say, listen, there's a group nearby that knows more than I do and has kind of a network and can hopefully point you in the direction of providers that are going to be knowledgeable. So yep, that is an invaluable to me as well, being able to point folks in your direction.
Thank you so much. Any further questions? We're running a little over time tonight, but we can make one final request out there. Anyone? Great. Thank you all for coming this evening and staying for the presentation. Paul, so grateful to have you come and share your knowledge.
Thank you very much.
Have a good evening, everyone.